The glass shattered against the marble floor before Alina even understood why her hand was shaking. It was not supposed to happen this way. Not tonight. Not at her own dinner table, surrounded by candlelight and the low hum of polite conversation, with the scent of roasted lamb still drifting from the kitchen. Yet here she was, standing at the head of a table that no longer felt like hers, watching her husband smile at another woman as though his wife did not exist. Alina Whitmore had married Duke Alastair Whitmore 9 years ago in a ceremony so grand that newspapers across the country had covered it for weeks. She had been 24 then, full of hope, wearing a white gown that took 12 seamstresses 3 months to complete. She remembered the way Alastair had looked at her that day, as though she were the only person in the world worth seeing. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that the feeling would last forever. It had not. Tonight's dinner was meant to celebrate the anniversary of Alastair's father, the late Duke, a man Alina had loved almost as much as she loved her own family. The guest list included cousins, business partners, a handful of old friends, and members of the extended Whitmore family who rarely gathered under one roof. Alina had spent 3 weeks planning every detail, from the floral arrangements to the seating chart, determined to make the evening perfect. She had not planned for Camille Ashford to be there. Camille arrived fashionably late, dressed in deep red, her dark hair pinned in soft waves that framed a face too polished to be natural. She walked into the dining hall as though she owned it, offering a small nod to the other guests before her eyes settled on Alastair. He rose from his seat immediately, a warmth in his expression that Alina had not seen directed at her in months. "Camille," he said, his voice carrying more affection than any introduction required. "I wasn't certain you'd make it." "I wouldn't have missed it," Camille replied, her gaze flicking briefly toward Alina almost as an afterthought. "Duchess, you look lovely as always." The words were polite enough on the surface, but something beneath them felt sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. Alina forced a smile and gestured toward an empty seat near the far end of the table, hoping to keep some distance between her husband and this woman she barely knew. But Alastair, without asking anyone, pulled out the chair beside his own. "Sit here," he said to Camille. "There's more room to talk." Alina's smile did not waver, though something inside her chest tightened. She had learned over the years to hide her feelings well. It was a skill every duchess needed, her mother had once told her. Never let them see you break. Never give them the satisfaction. So she sat at the head of the table, watching her husband lean toward another woman, and she said nothing. The first course arrived, a delicate soup garnished with fresh herbs from the estate's garden. Conversation flowed easily among the guests. Stories about the late Duke's love of horse racing, memories of childhood summers spent at the family's countryside home. Alina participated where she could, offering a laugh here, a comment there, though her attention kept drifting toward the far end of the table, where Alastair and Camille sat close together, their heads bent in quiet conversation. She caught fragments of their exchange, a private joke, a reference to a trip Alina knew nothing about, a gentle touch on the sleeve of Alastair's jacket that lingered a beat too long. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, no one said anything. That was the way of their world. Appearances mattered more than truth. A duchess who caused a scene was a duchess who lost respect, and respect, Alina had come to understand, was the only currency that truly mattered among people like them. By the time the second course arrived, a plate of roasted duck with a rich berry glaze, Alina had convinced herself she was overreacting. Perhaps Camille was simply an old friend, someone Alastair had known long before their marriage. Perhaps the closeness she witnessed was nothing more than familiarity between two people who had grown up in the same social circles. She wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. But then Camille laughed, loud enough for half the table to hear, and reached across to steady herself against Alastair's arm. "Oh, stop," she said, still laughing. "You always know how to make me laugh, even after all this time." "Some things never change," Alastair replied, and there was something in his voice, something soft and familiar that made Alina's stomach turn. She set down her fork, her appetite had vanished. An elderly cousin named Margaret, seated to Aline's left, leaned close and whispered, "Are you feeling well, dear? You've gone quite pale." "I'm fine," Aline said quickly, forcing another smile. "Just a bit tired, it's been a long week of preparations." Margaret studied her for a moment longer, concern flickering across her weathered face, before she nodded and returned to her meal. Aline appreciated the small mercy of being left alone, even if only for a moment. She glanced down the table again. Camille was speaking now, her voice low but not quite low enough. "You know," Camille said, addressing the group but clearly aiming her words elsewhere, "I always thought Alistair and I made quite the pair back in our younger days. Didn't we, Alistair, before duty called him elsewhere?" A few guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Aline felt every eye at the table shift briefly toward her, waiting to see how she would react. She kept her expression neutral, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though beneath the table her fingers had curled into tight fists. Alistair did not correct Camille. He did not offer any reassurance, any acknowledgement of the wife sitting only a few seats away. Instead, he simply smiled, a small private smile that seemed to say more than words ever could. Aline felt something inside her begin to crack, slow and quiet, like ice beneath the weight of a footstep. She thought back to the early years of their marriage, when Alistair used to write her letters even when they were staying in the same house. Simple notes left on her pillow that said things like "You make every room brighter" or "I count myself lucky each day." She had kept every one of those letters in a small wooden box in her private study, though she could not remember the last time he had written her anything at all. Somewhere between the demands of managing the estate and the endless social obligations that came with their titles, something had shifted between them. She had noticed the distance growing, the late nights that stretched longer, the trips that required no explanation. She had told herself it was simply the nature of his responsibilities, the burden of a man who carried an entire family legacy on his shoulders. She had been wrong to make excuses. She understood that now, watching him laugh with Camille as though Aline were nothing more than a piece of furniture at the table, present but unnoticed. The third course arrived, and with it, the moment that would change everything. A young server, nervous and clearly new to formal events, approached the table carrying a tray of wine glasses. As she reached Camille's side, her foot caught against the leg of the chair, and she stumbled forward. Camille, reacting quickly, threw out her arm to steady herself, and in doing so, knocked her wine glass directly into Aline's lap. The deep red liquid spread across the pale fabric of Aline's gown, a stain blooming like a wound. Gasps rippled around the table. The young server apologized frantically, her hands trembling as she reached for a napkin. Aline rose from her seat, forcing calm into her voice as she assured the girl it was only an accident, that no harm had been done. But then Camille spoke, and her words carried no apology at all. "Well," she said, a faint smile curling at the corner of her lips, "I suppose that dress was a bit too pale for a woman your age anyway. Red suits you better, Duchess. More fitting, don't you think?" The table fell silent. Aline felt her face flush with heat, humiliation crawling up her neck like something alive. She waited, every fiber of her being hoping that Alistair would say something, anything, to defend her. A simple word, a look of disapproval directed at Camille, some small sign that he still saw her as his wife, deserving of basic respect at her own table. He said nothing. He did not even glance in her direction. Instead, he reached for his wine glass and took a slow sip, his eyes fixed somewhere on the far wall, as though the moment held no significance to him at all. That silence told Aline everything she needed to know. She excused herself calmly, her voice steady despite the storm raging beneath her composed exterior, and walked toward the hallway to find something to clean the stain from her gown. As she passed behind Alistair's chair, she paused for just a moment, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough to remember what it once felt like to matter to this man. He did not look up. Aline continued walking, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, each step carrying her further from the table where her marriage sat exposed for everyone to witness. She reached the hallway and pressed her back against the cool stone wall, closing her eyes, willing herself not to cry in a house full of guests who would surely notice. She thought of her mother's words, "Never let them see you break." But something had already broken. She could feel it, deep in her chest, a quiet fracture that no amount of composure could hide from herself, even if she managed to hide it from everyone else. Somewhere behind her, laughter drifted from the dining hall, Camille's voice rising above the others, easy and unbothered, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Elinor opened her eyes and stared at her reflection in the darkened window at the end of the hallway. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, elegant and composed on the surface, but hollow underneath, worn down by years of small humiliations she had convinced herself to overlook. Tonight was different, though she could not yet explain why. Perhaps it was the accumulation of every quiet slight she had endured over the years, finally reaching a breaking point. Perhaps it was simply the exhaustion of pretending not to see what had been in front of her all along. Whatever the reason, something inside Elinor Whitmore had shifted, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she could not continue living this way. She smoothed the front of her stained gown, took a slow breath, and turned back toward the dining hall, unaware that the events still to come that evening would change the course of her entire life. Elinor returned to the dining hall with her chin held high, though the stain on her gown remained a visible reminder of the humiliation she had just endured. She had changed nothing except her expression, replacing the raw hurt with a mask of practiced calm, the same mask she had worn through countless difficult evenings over the years. The conversation at the table shifted as she approached, guests suddenly finding new topics to discuss, avoiding her eyes as though embarrassed on her behalf. Only Margaret, the elderly cousin seated beside her, reached out and gently squeezed her hand as she sat down. "You handled that with grace," Margaret whispered, "more grace than I could have managed." Elinor offered a small, grateful smile, though she said nothing in response. She was not certain grace was the right word for what she felt. It felt more like survival, the kind of quiet endurance that came from years of practice in swallowing pain and presenting something smoother to the world. Across the table, Camille had resumed her conversation with Alastair as though nothing had happened at all. Her laughter rang out again, light and careless, and Alastair leaned closer to catch whatever joke she had shared. Elinor watched them for a moment, studying the ease between them, the familiarity that seemed to stretch back further than a simple friendship should allow. She began to wonder how long this had been happening. Not just tonight, but before tonight. How many other evenings had she missed the signs, too consumed by her own responsibilities to notice the shift happening right beside her? The fourth course arrived, a light salad meant to cleanse the palate before dessert, but Elinor found she had no appetite left at all. She pushed the greens around her plate, half listening to a conversation about upcoming charity events that another guest, a soft-spoken woman named Priya, tried to include her in. "The Children's Hospital Gala is next month," Priya said, her voice warm and genuine. "I hope you'll be attending again this year, Duchess. Your presence always brings in such generous donations." "Of course," Elinor replied, grateful for the distraction. "I wouldn't miss it." "You're always so dedicated to your causes," Priya continued. "I don't know how you manage everything, the estate, the charities, the social calendar." "It must be exhausting." Elinor almost laughed at the irony of the comment. Exhausting did not begin to describe the weight she had carried for years, much of it invisible to the people around her. She managed the estate's finances when Alastair claimed he had no time. She organized every social event that maintained the family's public image. She smiled through countless dinners just like this one, absorbing whatever discomfort came her way so that the Whitmore name remained untarnished. And in return she received silence, distance, indifference disguised as duty. "It has its challenges," Elinor said simply, unwilling to reveal more than that in present company. As the conversation continued around her, Alina's attention drifted back to Alistair and Camille. She noticed something she had missed before, a small gesture that sent a fresh wave of unease through her chest. Camille had reached into her small evening bag and withdrawn something, sliding it across the table toward Alistair with practiced discretion. He accepted it without hesitation, tucking it into the inner pocket of his jacket before anyone else could notice. Alina noticed. She could not tell what the object had been, only that it was small enough to fit in a closed palm, and that the exchange had been rehearsed, familiar, the kind of gesture two people repeat often enough that it becomes second nature. A folded note, perhaps, a small trinket, something that carried meaning between them, meaning Alina was clearly not meant to understand. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last, though she forced herself to remain calm, to keep her expression neutral even as questions multiplied inside her. The dessert course arrived, a delicate chocolate torte that under any other circumstances Alina would have enjoyed. Tonight, she barely tasted it. Her thoughts remained fixed on the small exchange she had witnessed, replaying it over and over, searching for an innocent explanation that refused to present itself. Conversation around the table grew louder as the wine continued to flow, guests relaxing into easy laughter and old stories. Alina's uncle, a boisterous man named Edmund who had known the Whitmore family for decades, stood to offer a toast in honor of the late Duke. "To a man who built something lasting," Edmund said, raising his glass, "and to the family who continues his legacy with honor and grace." Glasses rose around the table, a chorus of agreement following the toast. Alina raised her own glass, though the words felt hollow given everything she had witnessed that evening. She glanced toward Alistair as everyone drank, hoping to catch some flicker of the man she had once loved so deeply, some sign that the warmth between them still existed beneath the layers of neglect that had built up over time. Instead, she found him watching Camille, his expression soft in a way it had not been directed at Alina in longer than she cared to admit. The toast ended, and conversation resumed its previous rhythm. Alina excused herself once more, this time citing a need for fresh air, and stepped through the tall glass doors that led to the estate's private garden. The night air was cool against her skin, a welcome relief after the stifling tension of the dining hall. She walked slowly along the stone pathway, past rows of carefully tended roses that had been her mother-in-law's pride before her passing. The garden had always been Alina's refuge, a place where she could think clearly without the weight of watching eyes and expectant smiles. She sat on a stone bench near the center of the garden, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill, and allowed herself, finally, a moment of honesty. Her marriage was failing. Perhaps it had been failing for years, and she had simply refused to see it, too invested in maintaining appearances to acknowledge the truth staring back at her. Tonight had forced that truth into the open, undeniable and impossible to ignore any longer. She thought about the early days of their courtship, when Alistair had pursued her with genuine devotion, writing letters, sending flowers, making time for long walks through this very garden despite his busy schedule managing the estate's affairs. She remembered believing, with the certainty of youth, that their love would only grow stronger with time. Instead, it had withered, slowly and quietly, until nothing remained but obligation and habit. A soft rustling sound from nearby pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find her younger sister, Charlotte, standing at the edge of the garden path, her expression full of concern. "I saw what happened at dinner," Charlotte said, moving closer to sit beside Alina on the bench. "That woman had no right to speak to you that way." "It's fine," Alina said automatically, though even she could hear how unconvincing the words sounded. "It's not fine," Charlotte replied firmly. "And Alistair sat there and said nothing. I watched him, Alina. He didn't even look at you." Alina closed her eyes, feeling the truth of her sister's words settle heavily in her chest. She had hoped, foolishly, that perhaps she had imagined the extent of Alistair's indifference, that her own exhaustion had colored her perception of the evening. But Charlotte had seen it too, confirming what Alina already knew in her heart. "How long has this been happening?" Charlotte asked gently. The distance between you two. I've noticed it for months, but I didn't want to say anything unless you brought it up first. Alina opened her eyes and stared out at the moonlit garden, considering how to answer honestly. I think I've known for a while, she admitted quietly. I just didn't want to see it. It's easier to pretend everything is fine than to face what it means if it isn't. And what does it mean? Charlotte asked. Alina did not answer immediately. The question hung in the cool night air between them, heavy with implications she was not yet ready to voice aloud. She thought about the years she had invested in this marriage, the sacrifices she had made, the identity she had built around being Alistair's wife, the Duchess of Whitmore. To acknowledge that it might be ending felt like acknowledging the collapse of everything she had worked to build. But sitting there in the quiet garden, away from the watching eyes of dinner guests and the weight of expectations, Alina allowed herself to consider a question she had avoided for far too long. What if she deserved better than this? I don't know what it means yet, she finally said to Charlotte, but I know I can't keep pretending everything is fine, not after tonight. Charlotte reached over and took her sister's hand, squeezing it gently. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. You know that. I know, Alina said, offering a small smile despite everything. Thank you for coming out here. I wasn't going to let you sit alone after what happened, Charlotte said. Come on, let's get you cleaned up before we go back inside. That stain isn't going to disappear on its own. The two sisters rose from the bench and made their way toward a side entrance of the estate, one that led directly to Alina's private chambers without passing back through the dining hall. As they walked, Alina felt a strange sense of clarity settling over her, different from the confusion and hurt that had consumed her earlier in the evening. She still did not know exactly what she would do, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she understood that something needed to change. She could not continue living as an afterthought in her own marriage, tolerating humiliation for the sake of appearances that meant less to her with each passing year. They reached Alina's chambers, and Charlotte helped her change into a fresh gown, a deep emerald color that complemented Alina's dark hair and pale skin. As Alina studied her reflection in the mirror, she noticed something different in her own eyes, a hardness that had not been there before, born from the events of the evening. You look beautiful, Charlotte said softly, standing behind her. I feel like a different person, Alina admitted. Like something inside me shifted tonight, and I can't go back to who I was before. Charlotte met her sister's gaze in the mirror's reflection. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Alina considered the words carefully. Perhaps her sister was right. Perhaps the person she had been, the woman who accepted silence and neglect as the price of maintaining her title, was not someone worth returning to. Perhaps tonight marked the beginning of something new, even if she could not yet see clearly what that something would become. We should go back, Alina said finally, smoothing the front of her new gown. The dinner isn't over yet, and I refuse to give anyone the satisfaction of thinking I've been driven away. Charlotte smiled with obvious pride. That's the sister I know. Together, they made their way back toward the dining hall, unaware that the remainder of the evening held revelations far more damaging than anything Alina had witnessed so far. Revelations that would force her to confront the truth of her marriage in ways she never could have anticipated. As they approached the tall wooden doors leading back into the dining hall, Alina paused for just a moment, gathering her composure one final time. Whatever waited on the other side, she promised herself she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every difficult moment of her marriage. She had no way of knowing, in that brief pause before pushing open the doors, that this particular evening was about to become the moment everything finally broke apart, clearing the way for a truth she could no longer avoid. The dining hall had grown louder in Alina's absence, the wine having loosened tongues and softened the careful formality that usually governed such gatherings. She entered with Charlotte close behind her, and several heads turned at her arrival, eyes flicking briefly to the change in her gown before returning to their conversations with practiced discretion. Alistair did not look up. Alina took her seat at the head of the table once more, her posture perfectly composed, though beneath the surface a quiet storm continued to build. She reached for her water glass, needing something to occupy her hands, and forced herself to engage with the conversation happening around her. "Duchess, you simply must tell us about the renovations planned for the East Wing," said a distant cousin named Fiona, clearly attempting to draw Alina back into the evening's rhythm. "I heard you've commissioned an entirely new library." "Yes," Alina replied, grateful for a topic that required no emotional investment. "The old library suffered water damage last winter. We're restoring it with a focus on preserving the original architecture while adding modern shelving systems." "How wonderful," Fiona said. "You always have such wonderful taste." The conversation continued in this manner for several minutes, safe and pleasant, and Alina allowed herself to relax slightly into the familiar rhythm of hosting. Perhaps the worst of the evening had passed. Perhaps she could simply endure the remaining hours and retreat to her private chambers once the guests departed. That hope proved short-lived. Camille, who had remained relatively quiet during the exchange about the library, suddenly leaned forward, her wine glass in hand, an expression of feigned innocence painted across her features. "Speaking of renovations," Camille said, her voice carrying easily across the table, "I heard the loveliest story recently about hidden rooms in old estates like this one. Secret spaces where certain family members might keep things they'd rather others not find." The comment seemed harmless enough on the surface, but something in Camille's tone sent a ripple of unease through Alina. She glanced toward Alistair, whose jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, though he said nothing to steer the conversation elsewhere. "How intriguing," Fiona said, oblivious to the tension building beneath the surface. "Does this estate have such hidden rooms, Duchess?" "Not that I'm aware of," Alina said carefully, though a growing sense of dread settled in her stomach. "Perhaps Camille has heard rumors about a different property." "Perhaps," Camille replied, her smile widening in a way that felt more like a warning than agreement. "Though I do wonder sometimes what secrets a house this large might hold. Old letters, forgotten promises, that sort of thing." Alistair set down his wine glass with more force than necessary, the sound sharp enough to draw a few curious glances. "Camille, perhaps we should discuss something else." "Of course," Camille said smoothly, though her eyes remained fixed on Alina with an intensity that made the Duchess distinctly uncomfortable. "I only meant it as innocent conversation. No harm intended, Duchess." But Alina understood, with growing certainty, that harm was precisely what Camille intended. Every word from this woman's mouth tonight had been calculated, designed to unsettle, to embarrass, to remind Alina of her own perceived inadequacy in front of an audience that would remember every detail. The question remained, however, what exactly Camille was implying with her talk of hidden rooms and forgotten promises. Alina's mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Dinner continued, though the earlier ease had been replaced by a careful tension that even the less observant guests began to notice. Conversations grew quieter, more measured, as though everyone sensed something significant simmering beneath the polished surface of the evening. It was during the final course, as servants cleared away dessert plates and began preparing coffee, that everything finally came apart. Camille rose from her seat, ostensibly to retrieve something from her evening bag, but instead of returning to her chair, she walked slowly around the table until she stood directly behind Alistair. She placed both hands on his shoulders, a gesture far too intimate for the setting, and leaned down close to his ear. "Shall I tell them, or would you prefer to?" she asked, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to those seated nearby. The table fell into an uncomfortable silence. Alistair's face had gone pale, his usual composure cracking for the first time that evening. "Camille," he said, his voice low and warning. "Not here." "Why not here?" Camille asked, straightening but keeping one hand resting possessively on his shoulder. "Everyone who matters is already at this table. Wouldn't it be easier to simply be honest, rather than continuing this exhausting charade?" Alina's heart began pounding against her ribs, a cold certainty settling over her that whatever Camille intended to reveal would change everything. "What is she talking about, Alistair?" Alina asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Alistair opened his mouth, then closed it again, seemingly unable to find words. Camille, apparently growing impatient with his silence, decided to speak for him. "Your husband and I have known each other for many years, Duchess," Camille began, addressing the entire table now, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "Long before he married you, in fact, we had an understanding once. A promise that circumstances forced him to set aside for the sake of duty and family expectations." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Alina felt her hands trembling beneath the table, though she forced her expression to remain calm, refusing to give Camille the satisfaction of visible distress. "I don't understand," Alina said, though a sinking feeling in her stomach suggested she was beginning to understand all too well. "What Camille is referring to," Alistair finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "happened before we ever met, Alina. It has nothing to do with our marriage." "Nothing to do with it," Camille repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Is that truly what you tell yourself, Alistair? What about the letters you continued sending, even after the wedding? What about the meetings you claimed were business matters, when we both know exactly what they were?" Alina felt the room tilt slightly around her, the weight of Camille's words settling like stones in her chest. She thought back to the small exchange she had witnessed earlier, the object Camille had slipped into Alistair's jacket pocket. Everything suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "How long has this been going on?" Alina asked, her voice quieter now, though every guest at the table strained to hear her question. Alistair did not answer immediately, and his silence spoke louder than any words could have. "Years," Camille answered for him, her expression softening slightly, though whether from genuine regret or simple satisfaction at finally revealing the truth, Alina could not tell. "On and off, throughout your entire marriage. I'm sorry you had to learn this way, Duchess, truly. But I grew tired of being kept in the shadows, treated as though I mattered less simply because I never received a title." Alina stared at her husband, searching his face for some sign of denial, some indication that Camille had exaggerated or lied. But Alistair's expression held nothing but guilt, confirming everything Alina had just heard. "Say something," Alina said, her voice breaking slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Alistair, please say something." "I never meant for you to find out this way," Alistair finally said, his voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you, Alina. What happened between Camille and me, it's complicated. It's not something I can simply explain away." "Complicated," Alina repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "You let this woman humiliate me at my own dinner table, spilling wine on my gown, mocking my age, hinting at secrets you shared together, and all you can offer me is that it's complicated." The other guests sat in stunned silence, no one quite certain how to respond to the scene unfolding before them. Charlotte reached over and took Alina's hand beneath the table, offering silent support as her sister's world collapsed in real time. "I need you to understand," Alistair continued, seemingly desperate now to salvage something from the wreckage of the evening, "that my feelings for you were always genuine. What happened with Camille was separate, something from before our marriage that simply continued longer than it should have. It doesn't diminish what we built together." "Doesn't diminish it?" Alina asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "You've spent years lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, while I devoted myself entirely to this marriage, to this family, to maintaining an image that apparently meant nothing to you all along." Camille, seemingly satisfied with the chaos she had unleashed, took her seat once more, watching the exchange with an expression that bordered on amusement. Alina felt a fresh wave of anger rise within her, directed now not just at her husband, but at the woman who had clearly enjoyed every moment of this cruel revelation. "Why now?" Alina asked, turning her attention to Camille. "If this has been going on for years, why choose tonight in front of everyone to reveal it?" Camille shrugged, an infuriatingly casual gesture given the devastation she had just caused. I grew tired of waiting for him to choose me properly, Duchess. I thought perhaps forcing the truth into the open might finally push him toward making a real decision, rather than continuing this pattern of empty promises. So you used me, Alina said, understanding dawning with painful clarity. You embarrassed me publicly, not out of any genuine desire to reveal the truth, but as a manipulation tactic to force your own agenda. Camille's expression flickered, the confident mask slipping slightly at being so accurately called out. That's not entirely fair. Isn't it? Alina asked, her voice growing steadier now, anger replacing the initial shock that had gripped her. You could have spoken to me privately at any point over these past years, if honesty truly mattered to you. Instead, you chose a public dinner, chose to humiliate me in front of family and friends, all because you grew impatient waiting for a man who apparently cannot be honest with either of us. The table remained silent, guests exchanging uncomfortable glances, uncertain whether to intervene or simply watch the confrontation unfold. Edmund, Alina's uncle, finally cleared his throat. Perhaps this conversation would be better suited for a more private setting, he suggested gently, though the suggestion felt woefully inadequate given everything that had already been revealed. No, Alina said firmly, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. Everyone at this table has already witnessed the humiliation orchestrated against me tonight. I see no reason to retreat to privacy now, when the damage has already been done in full view of everyone present. She turned back to Alistair, studying his face one final time, searching for any last trace of the man she had once loved so completely. What she found instead was a stranger, someone whose true character had finally been exposed after years of careful concealment. How many years, Alistair? She asked again, needing to hear the specific answer despite the pain it would undoubtedly cause. How many years have you been living a double life, while I remained faithful, devoted, believing in promises you had no intention of keeping? Alistair's silence stretched long enough that Camille eventually answered for him once more. Since before your wedding, she said quietly. He never truly ended things between us, Duchess. He simply became more careful about hiding it. Alina closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the full weight of this final confirmation. 9 years of marriage, and apparently every single one of them had been built upon a foundation of lies. Every late night, every unexplained trip, every moment of distance she had excused as the burden of duty, all of it suddenly made a devastating kind of sense. When she opened her eyes again, something had settled within her, a clarity born from the ashes of everything she had believed to be true about her life. She looked at Alistair one final time, and for the first time that evening, she did not see anger reflected in her own expression when she caught her reflection in the darkened window behind him. She saw something else entirely, something that felt remarkably like freedom beginning to take root beneath the pain. "Thank you," she said quietly, surprising everyone at the table including herself. "Thank you," Alistair repeated, clearly confused by her response. "For finally showing me the truth," Alina said, her voice steady and clear. "Even if it took a public humiliation to force it into the open, I would rather know the reality of my marriage than continue living within a lie." She rose from her seat then, every eye at the table following her movement, and reached toward her left hand, where her wedding ring had sat for 9 years, a symbol of promises that had apparently meant nothing to the man who made them. Alina's fingers paused just above the ring, the diamond catching the candlelight in a way that once made her heart swell with pride, but now felt more like a shackle she had worn without realizing its true weight. The table watched, breathless, waiting to see whether she would truly remove the symbol of her marriage in front of everyone who had witnessed its collapse. She hesitated, not from doubt, but because something inside her wanted this final act to mean something. Not a hasty gesture born from anger, but a deliberate choice made with full understanding of what it represented. "Alina," Alistair said, his voice pleading now, all pretense of composure abandoned. "Please, let's discuss this privately. Not like this, not in front of everyone." You didn't extend me that same courtesy tonight, Alina replied, her voice remarkably calm given the turmoil she felt inside. You allowed this woman to embarrass me publicly, to mock my age, to spill wine on my gown and imply things she knew would hurt me, and you said nothing. You sat silent while I searched for any sign that you still valued me as your wife. I was trying to figure out how to handle the situation, Alistair said weakly. I didn't expect Camille to reveal everything tonight in this manner. But you knew this moment would eventually come, Alina countered. You knew that eventually the truth would surface, and you continued lying to me regardless, allowing me to invest years more of my life into a marriage you had already betrayed. Charlotte squeezed Alina's hand beneath the table, a silent gesture of support that gave Alina the strength to continue. I gave you everything, Alina continued, addressing Alistair directly now, though her words seemed to carry to every corner of the silent dining hall. I gave you my loyalty, my devotion, my willingness to overlook your absences and your distance, always believing that duty and responsibility explained everything. I never once suspected that the real explanation was far simpler and far more painful. Camille shifted uncomfortably in her seat, seemingly beginning to recognize that the evening had not unfolded quite as satisfyingly as she had anticipated. Rather than watching Alina crumble beneath humiliation, she instead witnessed something entirely different taking shape, a quiet strength emerging from the wreckage of betrayal. I understand you're angry, Alistair said, attempting once more to salvage the situation. You have every right to be angry. But please, don't make a permanent decision in a moment of heightened emotion. This isn't a moment of heightened emotion, Alistair, Alina said, her voice steady and clear. This is clarity, finally arriving after years of confusion and self-doubt. I spent so long questioning my own instincts, convincing myself that the distance between us was simply the natural result of your responsibilities, when in reality you were choosing someone else, again and again, while I remained faithful and devoted. She turned her attention briefly to Camille, studying the woman who had orchestrated tonight's devastating revelation. And you, Alina said, you clearly believed that humiliating me would somehow secure your position, would finally force Alistair to choose you openly. But consider this. A man who lies to one woman for years will likely lie to another. If he chooses you now, what guarantee do you have that he won't repeat this same pattern of deception when someone new eventually catches his interest? Camille's confident expression faltered slightly, uncertainty flickering across her features for the first time that evening. She had clearly not considered this particular angle, too focused on her own desire for recognition to think beyond the immediate satisfaction of exposing the affair. That's not fair, Camille said quietly, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Perhaps not, Alina acknowledged. But neither was tonight's humiliation, which you orchestrated with careful precision, apparently believing that my pain would somehow validate your own position in this situation. The dining hall remained utterly silent, guests too stunned by the unfolding drama to offer any commentary of their own. Even Edmund, usually quick to smooth over uncomfortable social situations, seemed at a complete loss for words. Alina returned her attention to Alistair, and something in her expression must have conveyed the finality of her decision, because his face grew increasingly desperate. Please, he said again, rising from his seat now, moving toward her with his hands outstretched, though he stopped short of actually touching her. Whatever you're about to do, please reconsider. We built something together, Alina. 9 years of marriage, this estate, our shared responsibilities to the family legacy. Don't throw that away in a single moment. You threw it away long before tonight, Alina said quietly. You threw it away every time you chose to meet with Camille instead of coming home to me. You threw it away every time you allowed me to believe your lies about business trips and important meetings. Tonight, you simply made the consequences of those choices visible to everyone else. She reached again toward her ring, and this time she did not hesitate. With steady fingers, she slid the diamond band from her finger, feeling the weight of 9 years lift from her hand as the ring came free. She held it for a moment, studying the way the candlelight danced across its surface, remembering the promises that had accompanied its placement on her finger all those years ago. Then, without ceremony or dramatic flourish, she set the ring down gently beside Alistair's plate, the small metallic sound somehow louder than any words could have been in the silence that followed. "I release you from whatever obligation you felt toward me," Elinor said, her voice carrying clearly through the dining hall. "You're free now to pursue whatever life you truly want, without the burden of pretending devotion to a wife you clearly stopped valuing long ago." Alistair stared down at the ring, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as the reality of the situation finally seemed to settle over him. "Elinor, please, I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I never stopped loving you. Please don't do this." "Love doesn't look like years of deception," Elinor replied, her voice softer now, though no less resolute. "Love doesn't allow someone else to humiliate their partner at a dinner table while remaining silent. Whatever feelings you believe you still hold for me, they clearly weren't strong enough to prevent this betrayal, and they aren't strong enough now to change what needs to happen." She turned to Charlotte, who rose immediately from her seat, understanding without words that Elinor needed her support in this moment. "I'm going to gather a few belongings," Elinor announced to the table, her voice remarkably composed given the magnitude of what had just transpired. "I won't be staying here tonight, and I suspect, given everything that has been revealed, I won't be staying here again." Gasps rippled through the remaining guests, several exchanging glances that suggested they had not expected the evening to culminate in such a decisive conclusion. Margaret, the elderly cousin who had offered comfort earlier in the evening, rose from her seat as well. "Elinor, dear, are you certain? Perhaps after some time to process everything, once emotions have settled." "I'm certain," Elinor interrupted gently, though firmly. "This isn't a decision born from anger alone, Margaret, though anger certainly plays a part. This is a decision born from finally understanding my own worth, something I apparently forgot somewhere along the way during this marriage." Alistair made one final attempt, moving closer, his voice dropping to something almost desperate. "What about everything we've built together? The estate, our shared history, the life we created." "You built a life with two women simultaneously, Alistair," Elinor said, her voice sharp now, cutting through his pleading tone. "I only ever built a life with one man, believing him to be faithful and devoted. That's not the same thing at all, and I refuse to continue pretending otherwise for the sake of appearances that clearly meant nothing to you." She turned away from him then, walking toward the hallway that led to her private chambers, Charlotte following closely behind her. Behind them, the dining hall erupted into hushed conversation, guests processing the dramatic scene they had just witnessed, though Elinor no longer cared what anyone thought or said about the situation. As they reached the staircase leading to Elinor's private wing, Charlotte finally spoke. "That was incredibly brave, what you just did." "It didn't feel brave," Elinor admitted, her composure finally beginning to crack now that she was away from the watching eyes of the dinner guests. "It felt necessary, like the only thing I could do to preserve whatever dignity remained after everything that happened tonight." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Charlotte said gently, wrapping an arm around her sister's shoulders as they climbed the stairs together. "Bravery isn't always a feeling. Sometimes it's simply doing what needs to be done, even when it terrifies you." Elinor allowed herself a small, tired smile at her sister's words. "When did you become so wise?" "I learned from watching you," Charlotte replied. "Even tonight, even after everything, you handled yourself with more strength than most people could manage in far less devastating circumstances." They reached Elinor's private chambers, and Charlotte immediately began helping her pack a small bag, gathering only essential items for the night ahead. Elinor moved through the familiar space, her home for 9 years, feeling a strange detachment settling over her, as though she were already beginning to separate herself emotionally from this place that no longer felt like her own. As she packed a few personal items into a small leather bag, her eyes fell upon the wooden box she had mentioned earlier, the one containing Alistair's early letters from their courtship. She hesitated for a moment, uncertain whether to bring the box with her or leave it behind entirely. Finally, she opened the box and removed the letters, spreading them across her dressing table. She read through several quickly, remembering the promises they contained, the devotion Alistair had once professed so eloquently. Comparing those words to the reality she had just witnessed downstairs, the letters felt like artifacts from a different life entirely, written by a man who no longer existed, if he had ever truly existed at all. She left the letters on the dressing table, choosing not to carry them forward into whatever new chapter of her life was about to begin. Some things, she realized, were better left behind entirely, rather than carried forward as painful reminders of promises broken. "Are you ready?" Charlotte asked, watching her sister with concern as Alina finished gathering her belongings. "I don't know if I'll ever truly be ready," Alina admitted honestly. "But I know I can't stay here another night, not after everything that happened, not after finally understanding the truth about my marriage." Together, they made their way toward a side exit, avoiding the main hallway that would have led them back past the dining room. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Alina paused for just a moment, looking back at the grand estate that had been her home for nearly a decade. She thought about all the years she had invested in this place, in this marriage, in maintaining an image of perfect happiness that had apparently been nothing more than an elaborate illusion. Standing there in the darkness, with her sister beside her and her wedding ring left behind on a dinner table, Alina felt something unexpected beginning to take root within her chest. Not despair, though certainly grief remained present for everything she had lost. Instead, she felt something closer to possibility, a quiet recognition that perhaps this devastating ending might also mark the beginning of something entirely new, something built on truth rather than carefully maintained illusions. She had no way of knowing, as she walked away from the estate that night, exactly what challenges and discoveries awaited her in the days ahead. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alina Whitmore felt genuinely curious about her own future, rather than simply enduring it. The drive to Charlotte's apartment passed in near silence, the city lights blurring past the car windows as Alina stared out into the darkness, her mind replaying every moment of the evening in fragmented pieces. The wine stain on the gown she had discarded, Camille's cruel smile, Alistair's silence, the weight of the ring as she set it down beside his plate. Charlotte drove carefully, occasionally glancing toward her sister, uncertain whether to fill the silence with conversation or allow Alina the space to process everything alone. She chose the latter, understanding that some wounds required quiet before they could begin healing. When they arrived at Charlotte's modest apartment, a comfortable space filled with warm lighting and the lingering scent of jasmine tea, Alina found herself standing awkwardly in the entryway, uncertain how to proceed. She had spent 9 years as the mistress of a grand estate, and suddenly she was a guest in her sister's living room, carrying a small bag containing the sum total of her immediate possessions. "You can stay as long as you need," Charlotte said, sensing her sister's discomfort. "There's no rush to figure anything out tonight." "Thank you," Alina said quietly, settling onto the sofa while Charlotte moved toward the kitchen to prepare tea. "I don't even know where to begin processing everything that happened." "You don't have to figure it out tonight," Charlotte called from the kitchen. "Tonight, you just need to breathe and rest. Everything else can wait until morning." Alina appreciated her sister's wisdom, though sleep felt impossibly distant as her mind continued racing through the events of the evening. She accepted the cup of tea Charlotte handed her a few minutes later, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic, grateful for the small comfort it provided. "Do you think he'll try to contact you?" Charlotte asked, settling into the armchair across from the sofa. "I don't know," Alina admitted. "Part of me expects him to, if only to salvage his public image rather than any genuine desire to repair what's broken between us." "And if he does reach out, what will you say?" Alina considered the question carefully before answering. "I think I need time before I can answer that honestly. Right now, everything feels too raw, too immediate. I need distance before I can think clearly about what comes next." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the tea slowly cooling in their hands as exhaustion began settling over both of them. Eventually, Charlotte showed Alina to the guest room, a small but cozy space with soft blankets and a window overlooking the quiet street below. "Try to get some rest," Charlotte said, pausing in the doorway. "I know that probably feels impossible right now, but you need it, even if sleep doesn't come easily." Alina nodded, offering her sister a tired smile of gratitude before Charlotte closed the door softly behind her. Alone in the unfamiliar room, Alina changed into borrowed pajamas and climbed into the small bed, staring up at the ceiling as her thoughts continued their relentless cycle through the evening's events. Sleep did not come easily, exactly as Charlotte had predicted. Alina lay awake for hours, her mind alternating between anger, grief, and an unexpected sense of clarity that felt almost foreign after years of quiet confusion about her marriage. When exhaustion finally overtook her sometime near dawn, her dreams were fragmented and restless, images of wine-stained gowns and candlelit tables blending with memories of happier times that now felt tainted by the revelations of the evening. She woke late the following morning to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. She reached for it groggily, her heart sinking as she saw Alistair's name displayed across the screen, along with a series of missed calls and text messages that had accumulated overnight. She did not answer, instead setting the phone aside and pulling herself out of bed, moving toward the small bathroom attached to the guest room. As she studied her reflection in the mirror, she noticed the toll the previous evening had taken, dark circles beneath her eyes and a tension in her expression that seemed to have become permanent overnight. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to shake off the heaviness that had settled over her, and made her way toward the kitchen, where the smell of coffee suggested Charlotte was already awake. "Good morning," Charlotte said, pouring a second cup of coffee as Alina entered the room. "How did you sleep?" "Not well," Alina admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Alistair has been calling and texting all morning." "Are you going to respond?" Alina considered the question while taking a slow sip of coffee. "Not yet. I need more time before I can have that conversation without simply reacting from anger and hurt." Charlotte nodded understandingly, joining her sister at the small kitchen table. "That seems wise. There's no rush to give him answers he hasn't earned yet." They sat together over breakfast, the conversation gradually shifting toward practical matters. Alina would need to retrieve additional belongings from the estate eventually, arrange for legal counsel regarding the dissolution of her marriage, and begin considering where she might live permanently, since Charlotte's apartment, while welcoming, offered only temporary shelter. "You know you can stay here as long as necessary," Charlotte reminded her again. "But I also understand you might want your own space eventually, once things settle." "I appreciate that," Alina said. "I think I need a few days just to process everything before I can start making concrete plans." The following days passed in a strange blur for Alina, oscillating between moments of clarity and overwhelming grief, as the reality of her situation continued settling into her consciousness. She ignored most of Alistair's calls, though she eventually responded to a few text messages, mostly to establish clear boundaries regarding communication, and to arrange a time to retrieve her remaining belongings from the estate. News of the dinner party incident had apparently spread quickly through their social circle, and Alina found herself receiving numerous messages from acquaintances, some offering genuine support, others seemingly more interested in the scandalous details than in her actual well-being. She responded to few of these messages, preferring instead to lean on the small circle of people she trusted completely, primarily Charlotte and a handful of close friends who had proven their loyalty over the years. One such friend, a woman named Priya who had spoken with her briefly during the dinner about charity events, reached out with genuine concern rather than curiosity about the scandal itself. "I don't need details if you're not ready to share them," Priya had written in her message. "I just want you to know I'm here if you need anything at all, whether that's someone to talk to or simply company to distract you from everything happening." Alina appreciated the genuine kindness behind the message, arranging to meet Priya for coffee later that week, grateful for the reminder that not everyone in her social circle viewed her recent troubles as simple entertainment. As the days progressed, Alina found herself slowly beginning to process not just the immediate betrayal, but the years of small compromises and quiet neglect that had preceded it. She began to recognize patterns she had previously excused or overlooked entirely, moments when Alistair's distance had felt like something more than simple business obligations, moments when her own instincts had tried to warn her about the true state of their marriage. She spent considerable time reflecting on her own identity, separate from her role as Duchess, separate from her marriage to Alistair. Before their wedding, Alina had been passionate about art history, had even considered pursuing curatorial work at a prestigious museum before her engagement, redirected her priorities entirely toward managing the estate and fulfilling her duties as a future duchess. She wondered, during quiet moments alone in Charlotte's guest room, what her life might look like now if she reconnected with those earlier passions and interests, rather than continuing to define herself solely through her relationship to Alistair and the Whitmore family name. A week after the dinner party, Alina finally agreed to meet with Alistair privately, believing that a direct conversation, conducted away from the pressures of an audience, might provide some clarity regarding how to proceed. They met at a quiet cafe rather than the estate, a neutral location that felt less charged with the weight of their shared history. Alistair arrived looking exhausted, his usual polished appearance replaced by something more disheveled and genuinely remorseful. He waited until they had both ordered coffee before finally speaking. "I don't know how to properly apologize for what happened," he began, his voice quiet and lacking its usual confidence. "For any of it, really. The years of deception, allowing Camille to humiliate you that night, my own cowardice in not addressing the situation directly when I had countless opportunities to do so." Alina listened silently, allowing him to continue without interruption, curious to hear whatever explanation or justification he might offer. "I think, somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that maintaining two separate lives was somehow manageable," Alistair continued. "That I could fulfill my duties as your husband while also holding on to something from my past that I wasn't ready to release. I understand now how selfish and destructive that thinking truly was. Why didn't you simply end things with Camille if you understood the harm it was causing?" Alina asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning, even if the answer would likely bring her no comfort. Alistair was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I think, honestly, part of me was afraid of losing the freedom that relationship represented. Marriage came with so many expectations, so much responsibility toward the family legacy, and Camille represented something different, something that existed outside those pressures. So I represented duty, and she represented escape," Alina said, the realization settling painfully into her chest despite already suspecting as much. "That's an oversimplification," Alistair said, though his tone suggested he recognized the fundamental truth in her observation, "but perhaps not entirely inaccurate." They continued talking for nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from practical matters regarding their separation to deeper questions about where their marriage had begun to unravel. Alina found the conversation simultaneously painful and clarifying, providing answers to questions she had carried for years without fully understanding their significance. By the end of their meeting, both had reached a mutual, if painful, understanding that reconciliation was not a realistic possibility. Too much damage had accumulated over too many years, and the trust required to rebuild their marriage had been irreparably shattered by the events at that dinner table. "I'll have my legal team draft the necessary paperwork," Alistair said as they prepared to leave the cafe. "I won't contest anything you're entitled to, Alina. You deserve that much, at least, given everything you sacrificed during our marriage." "Thank you," Alina said simply, though the words felt inadequate given the magnitude of what they were actually discussing, the formal dissolution of 9 years of shared history. As she walked away from the cafe that afternoon, Alina felt a strange mixture of relief and grief settling over her simultaneously. The conversation had provided closure of a sort, confirmation that her decision to leave had been correct, even necessary, given the depth of betrayal that had characterized their marriage. But closure did not erase the pain entirely, nor did it answer the more difficult question that continued lingering in her mind as she made her way back toward Charlotte's apartment. What exactly would her life look like now, separate from the identity she had built around being Alistair's wife, separate from the responsibilities and expectations that had defined nearly a decade of her existence? She did not yet have answers to these questions, but for the first time since that devastating dinner party, Alina felt genuinely ready to begin searching for them, rather than remaining trapped within a marriage that had long since stopped serving her genuine happiness and well-being. 3 weeks after the dinner party, Alina found herself standing in the grand entrance hall of the Whitmore estate for what she suspected would be one of her final visits. She had arranged this appointment carefully, coordinating with Alistair's assistant to ensure he would not be present during her scheduled time to collect her remaining belongings, preferring to avoid another emotionally charged confrontation if possible. The house felt different now, quieter somehow, though Alina recognized that the change existed primarily within her own perception rather than any actual alteration to the physical space. She had walked these halls countless times over 9 years, yet today, everything felt unfamiliar, as though she were viewing the estate through the eyes of a stranger rather than someone who had once called this place home. She moved methodically through her private chambers, packing clothing, personal items, and a few pieces of jewelry that held sentimental value separate from her marriage to Alistair. She left behind the wooden box of old letters, having already made peace with that decision weeks earlier, along with several items that felt too closely tied to her former identity as Duchess of Whitmore. As she worked, a soft knock sounded at her door, and Margaret, the elderly cousin who had offered comfort during that fateful dinner, stepped into the room. "I heard you were here today," Margaret said, her expression gentle and understanding. "I wanted to see you before you left if that's all right." "Of course," Alina said, setting aside the dress she had been folding to embrace the older woman warmly. "I appreciate you checking on me." "How are you managing, truly?" Margaret asked, settling into a chair near the window while Alina continued her packing. "Some days are better than others," Alina admitted honestly. "I still feel angry, and grief comes in waves I don't always expect, but underneath all of that, I also feel something I haven't felt in years." "What's that?" Margaret asked. "Hope, I think," Alina said, surprising herself with the honesty of her answer. "Not that everything will be easy moving forward, but hope that I might finally build a life that feels authentically mine, rather than simply fulfilling expectations placed upon me by others." Margaret smiled warmly, reaching out to squeeze Alina's hand. "That's a beautiful way to think about difficult circumstances. You've always possessed remarkable strength, dear, even when you couldn't see it clearly yourself." They talked for nearly an hour, Margaret sharing stories about her own experiences navigating difficult family circumstances decades earlier, offering perspective and comfort that Alina genuinely appreciated during this transitional period of her life. Before leaving, Margaret pressed a small piece of paper into Alina's hand, containing contact information for a friend who worked at a prestigious art museum in the city. "I remembered you once mentioned wanting to work in art history before your engagement redirected your priorities," Margaret said. "Perhaps it's time to reconnect with that earlier passion. My friend mentioned they're always looking for knowledgeable individuals to join their curatorial team." Alina felt tears threatening as she accepted the paper, moved by Margaret's thoughtfulness during a time when so much of her previous social circle had proven far less genuine in their support. "Thank you, Margaret. This means more than you probably realize." After Margaret departed, Alina finished packing her belongings, arranging for the estate staff to transport the boxes to Charlotte's apartment later that afternoon. As she made her final walk through the halls she had called home for nearly a decade, she found herself pausing outside the estate's grand library, the space she had spent considerable effort renovating and restoring in recent months. She stepped inside briefly, running her fingers along the newly installed shelving, remembering the countless hours she had spent overseeing this particular project. Regardless of everything that had transpired in her marriage, she felt genuine pride in this accomplishment, a tangible legacy she had created within the estate, separate from her failed relationship with Alistair. As she turned to leave the library, she nearly collided with Alistair himself, who apparently had returned to the estate earlier than his assistant had indicated. "Eleanor," he said, clearly startled by the unexpected encounter, "I didn't realize you were still here. I thought you would have finished collecting your belongings by now." "I'm nearly finished," Eleanor said, maintaining a calm, professional tone despite the awkwardness of the unplanned meeting. "I was just taking one final look at the library before departing." Alistair nodded, studying her for a long moment before speaking again. "The renovations turned out beautifully. You should be proud of the work you accomplished here." "Thank you," Eleanor said simply, uncertain how to navigate this unexpected conversation given everything that had transpired between them. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room before Alistair finally spoke again. "I heard from Margaret that you might be considering returning to art history work. I think that would suit you well, honestly. You always possessed such genuine passion for the subject, even during our early years together." "I'm considering it," Eleanor confirmed, surprised that he remembered this detail about her interests, given how thoroughly her role as Duchess had seemingly overshadowed her individual identity in recent years. "I hope you pursue it," Alistair said, his voice carrying genuine sincerity despite everything that had transpired between them. "You deserve to build a life that brings you genuine fulfillment, Eleanor, regardless of what happens between us moving forward." Eleanor studied her former husband carefully, searching for any trace of manipulation or ulterior motive behind his words, but found only what appeared to be genuine remorse and a sincere wish for her future happiness, however complicated that sentiment felt given the circumstances of their separation. "How are things with Camille?" Eleanor asked, curious despite herself about the woman who had orchestrated such dramatic revelations at that fateful dinner. Alistair's expression shifted, something like weariness settling across his features. "We're no longer in contact, actually. I think, in the aftermath of everything that happened, we both recognized that whatever existed between us was built on something unstable and ultimately unsustainable." Eleanor absorbed this information without significant emotional reaction, recognizing that Camille's fate, whatever it might be, no longer held particular relevance to her own life moving forward. "I hope you both find whatever peace you're seeking, separately from each other and from me." "That's remarkably generous, given everything I put you through," Alistair said quietly. "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged, "but holding on to anger toward both of you would only prevent me from moving forward with my own life. I'd rather focus my energy on building something new, rather than remaining tethered to resentment about the past." They stood together in comfortable silence for several moments, the weight of 9 years of shared history hanging between them, neither entirely certain how to properly conclude this unexpected final conversation. "I should finish gathering my remaining belongings," Eleanor finally said, breaking the silence. "I don't want to keep the staff waiting to transport everything to my sister's apartment." "Of course," Alistair said, stepping aside to allow her passage. "Eleanor, before you go, I want you to know that despite everything, despite my own failures and betrayals, I did genuinely love you during our years together. I understand that love wasn't enough, given how poorly I demonstrated it through my actions, but I wanted you to hear that directly from me." Eleanor paused, considering his words carefully before responding. "I believe you loved me in whatever capacity you were capable of at the time, Alistair, but love without honesty, without genuine commitment and respect, isn't sufficient to sustain a healthy marriage. I hope, in whatever relationships you pursue moving forward, you find the courage to be fully honest with your partner, rather than maintaining separate hidden lives." I hope so too, Alastair said quietly, seemingly absorbing the weight of her words with genuine reflection rather than defensiveness. Alina nodded once, a final acknowledgement between them, before turning and walking toward the estate's main entrance, leaving behind nearly a decade of shared history and the grand life she had once believed would define her entire future. As she stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, she felt the weight of the conversation settling over her, complicated emotions swirling together in ways she suspected would take considerable time to fully process. But beneath the grief and lingering anger, she also recognized something that felt remarkably like closure, a sense that this final conversation had provided the emotional conclusion necessary to truly begin moving forward. She retrieved her car from the estate's circular driveway, taking one final look at the grand building that had been her home for nearly a decade before pulling away, driving toward the city, and toward whatever uncertain future awaited her beyond the boundaries of the Whitmore family legacy. The drive back to Charlotte's apartment felt different from her departure weeks earlier, less chaotic and desperate, replaced instead by a quiet determination to build something new from the wreckage of her former life. She thought about the paper Margaret had given her, the contact information for the art museum, and felt a small spark of genuine excitement about the possibilities that might exist within that opportunity. For the first time since that devastating dinner party, Alina felt genuinely ready to look forward rather than backward, to focus on building a future defined by her own choices and passions, rather than continuing to define herself through her failed marriage and the betrayal that had ultimately ended it. She did not yet know exactly what shape her new life would take, but she understood with growing confidence that she possessed the strength and resilience necessary to create something meaningful, something authentically her own, separate from the identity she had spent 9 years building around being Alastair's wife. 2 months after the dinner party that changed everything, Alina sat in a small office overlooking the city, reviewing a stack of documents spread across an unfamiliar desk. The contact Margaret had provided led to an interview, and the interview led to an offer that Alina accepted with genuine enthusiasm, joining the curatorial team at the museum as an assistant researcher specializing in European decorative arts. The work felt different from anything she had experienced during her years as Duchess, challenging in ways that engaged her intellect rather than simply requiring her to maintain appearances and manage social obligations. She spent her days researching historical pieces, cataloging acquisitions, and collaborating with colleagues who valued her genuine knowledge and passion for the subject matter, rather than her title or social connections. Her supervisor, a warm and knowledgeable woman named Aisha, had quickly recognized Alina's natural talent for the work, praising her attention to detail and genuine curiosity about historical context. "You have wonderful instincts for this kind of research," Aisha commented one afternoon, reviewing a report Alina had prepared regarding a collection of 18th-century porcelain pieces. "Have you considered pursuing additional formal education in the field? I think you'd excel in a graduate program focused on art history." The suggestion planted a seed that continued growing over subsequent weeks, and Alina found herself researching graduate programs during quiet evenings in the small apartment she had finally secured for herself, a modest but comfortable space located within walking distance of the museum. Moving into her own apartment had represented another significant milestone in her journey toward independence, a tangible symbol that she was building a life entirely separate from her former marriage. The apartment lacked the grandeur of the Whitmore estate, certainly, but it held something the estate never truly possessed, at least not in recent years. A genuine sense of belonging entirely to herself, decorated according to her own preferences rather than expectations imposed by family tradition or social status. Charlotte visited frequently, always bringing small gifts to help furnish the new space, along with genuine enthusiasm about Alina's evolving career and independence. "I'm so proud of you," Charlotte said during one such visit, helping Alina arrange books on a newly purchased shelf. "Watching you build this new life, seeing you genuinely happy again, it means everything to me." I couldn't have managed any of this without your support, Alina replied honestly. Those first few weeks, I genuinely didn't know if I possessed the strength to rebuild everything from scratch. You possessed that strength all along, Charlotte said firmly. You simply needed the space and circumstances to remember it. Their relationship had grown even closer during this period of transition, the sisters spending considerable time together, as Alina navigated the practical and emotional challenges of building an entirely new life. Charlotte introduced her to a wider social circle, beyond the formal aristocratic gatherings Alina had grown accustomed to during her marriage, friends who valued genuine connection over social status and appearances. Through this expanded circle, Alina met Priya more frequently, their friendship deepening beyond the polite acquaintance that had characterized their earlier interactions during Alina's marriage. Priya, it turned out, possessed a sharp wit and genuine warmth that Alina had never fully appreciated during the constrained formal settings of aristocratic dinner parties. I always suspected there was more depth to you than most people at those events bothered to discover, Priya commented one evening as they shared dinner at a small restaurant near Alina's apartment. You always seemed slightly out of place at those formal gatherings, like you were performing a role rather than genuinely enjoying yourself. I think that's an accurate assessment, Alina admitted, laughing softly at the observation. I spent so many years performing the role of Duchess that I nearly forgot who I actually was underneath all that formality and expectation. And who are you now underneath everything? Priya asked, genuine curiosity coloring her expression. Alina considered the question thoughtfully before answering. I'm still discovering that honestly. But I think I'm someone who genuinely loves art history, who values authentic friendship over social status, and who finally understands that my own happiness matters, rather than simply existing to fulfill expectations others place upon me. Their friendship continued deepening over subsequent weeks, Priya becoming a trusted confidant, as Alina navigated the ongoing legal proceedings finalizing her divorce from Alistair. The process moved relatively smoothly, given his earlier promise not to contest her entitled settlements, though the formal dissolution of 9 years of marriage still carried significant emotional weight regardless of the amicable nature of the proceedings. Alina's legal team, recommended by a colleague at the museum, handled the practical matters efficiently while providing genuine support throughout the emotionally challenging process. By the time the divorce was finalized, nearly 4 months after that devastating dinner party, Alina felt genuinely prepared to close this particular chapter of her life entirely, ready to focus completely on the future she was building for herself. News of her successful transition into museum work had apparently circulated through their broader social circle, and Alina occasionally received messages from acquaintances expressing surprise, and sometimes admiration, at her apparent resilience and reinvention following such a public and devastating betrayal. She responded to these messages graciously but briefly, uninterested in dwelling extensively on the past when so much of her present energy remained focused on building something meaningful for her future. The scandal that had once threatened to define her identity within their social circle gradually faded into background noise, replaced by growing recognition of her genuine expertise and passion within the art history community. 6 months after the dinner party, Alina received formal acceptance into a graduate program specializing in European decorative arts, a prestigious opportunity that would allow her to deepen her expertise while continuing her work at the museum on a part-time basis. She celebrated the acceptance with Charlotte and Priya, the 3 women sharing champagne at Alina's apartment while discussing the exciting possibilities ahead. To new beginnings, Charlotte said, raising her glass in a toast. To finally choosing myself, Alina added, meeting her sister's eyes with genuine warmth and gratitude. To resilience, Priya offered, completing the toast with a warm smile. They drank together, celebrating not just the graduate program acceptance, but the entire journey Alina had undertaken over the preceding months, transforming devastating betrayal into genuine opportunity for growth and self-discovery. As the evening continued, conversation turned toward lighter topics: upcoming museum exhibitions, Charlotte's own career developments, and Priya's plans for an upcoming trip abroad. Alina found herself genuinely present in these conversations, engaged and interested in her friends' lives rather than distracted by lingering grief or resentment about her former marriage. Later that evening, after Charlotte and Priya had departed, Alina sat alone on her apartment balcony, looking out over the city lights spreading beneath her, reflecting on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone since that devastating evening at the Whitmore estate. She thought about the woman she had been that night, desperately maintaining composure while enduring public humiliation, searching her husband's face for any sign of loyalty or protection that never materialized. That woman had felt trapped, defined entirely by her marriage and her role within a family legacy that ultimately valued appearances over genuine happiness. The woman sitting on this balcony tonight felt entirely different. Someone who had rediscovered genuine passions and interests, who had built authentic friendships based on mutual respect rather than social obligation, who was actively pursuing educational and professional opportunities that brought genuine fulfillment rather than simply fulfilling external expectations. She understood, with growing clarity, that the devastating events of that dinner party, while undeniably painful, had ultimately catalyzed a transformation she might never have pursued otherwise, comfortable as she had become within the familiar patterns of her marriage, despite the underlying dysfunction and betrayal that had characterized it for years. Her phone buzzed softly on the table beside her, and she glanced down to see a message from Alistair, the first communication she had received from him in several weeks, since finalizing the divorce proceedings. "I heard about your graduate program acceptance through mutual acquaintances," the message read. "I wanted to say congratulations, genuinely. I always knew you possessed remarkable talent and intelligence, even if I failed to properly support and value those qualities during our marriage. I hope this new chapter brings you the happiness and fulfillment you deserve." Alina read the message twice, considering how to respond or whether to respond at all. Finally, she typed a brief but genuine reply. "Thank you, Alistair. I hope you're finding your own path forward as well." She set the phone aside, unwilling to allow this brief exchange to disrupt the peaceful contentment she had cultivated over recent months. Whatever remained of her relationship with Alistair now existed purely as distant acquaintances from a shared past, rather than anything resembling genuine emotional connection. Looking out over the city lights once more, Alina felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this particular moment, sitting alone but genuinely content on her own balcony, surrounded by a life she had built entirely through her own choices and efforts. The path ahead remained uncertain in many respects, filled with new challenges and opportunities she could not yet fully anticipate. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alina felt genuinely excited about that uncertainty, rather than fearful of it, understanding now that her own resilience and determination would carry her forward, regardless of whatever obstacles might arise. She rose from her chair as the evening grew cooler, moving back inside her apartment, this space that belonged entirely to her, filled with books about art history, photographs of genuine friendships, and the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt through courage and authentic self-discovery. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities at the museum, continued preparation for her upcoming graduate studies, and countless small decisions that would continue shaping her ongoing transformation. But tonight, Alina allowed herself simply to appreciate how far she had traveled since that devastating dinner party, and how much genuine strength she had discovered within herself throughout this remarkable journey toward independence and authentic happiness. 2 years passed, each month bringing new milestones and discoveries that continued reshaping Alina's understanding of who she truly was, separate from the identity she had once built entirely around her marriage to Alistair. She completed her graduate program with distinguished honors, her thesis on European decorative arts during the 18th century earning recognition from several prominent scholars within the field. Her career at the museum flourished alongside her academic achievements. What began as an assistant researcher position evolved into a full curatorial role, Alina's expertise and genuine passion for the subject matter earning respect from colleagues throughout the broader art history community. She curated her first major exhibition 18 months after joining the museum, a comprehensive collection exploring decorative arts across different European courts, drawing praise from critics and substantial public interest. The exhibition's opening night represented a significant personal milestone for Alina, standing confidently before a crowd of colleagues, scholars, and museum patrons, discussing her research and curatorial choices with genuine authority and passion. Charlotte and Priya attended, beaming with pride as they watched Alina navigate the evening with confidence entirely different from the careful, performative composure she had once maintained during her years as Duchess. "You look genuinely happy," Priya observed during a quiet moment away from the crowd. "Not just composed or pleasant, but actually happy." "I am happy," Alina confirmed, surprising herself slightly with how naturally the words emerged. "Genuinely, authentically happy, in a way I don't think I experienced during my entire marriage, even during what I once believed were the good years." Beyond her professional achievements, Alina's personal life had also continued evolving in meaningful ways. She had cultivated a rich network of authentic friendships, people who valued her genuine personality and interests rather than her former title or social connections. She traveled occasionally, pursuing research opportunities and simply exploring destinations that had always interested her but never fit within the rigid social calendar demanded by her previous life. She also, gradually and with genuine caution, began opening herself to new romantic possibilities. She met Daniel through a colleague at the museum, a professor specializing in architectural history who shared her passion for historical preservation and cultural heritage. Their relationship developed slowly, built on genuine friendship and mutual respect rather than the whirlwind romance that had characterized her courtship with Alastair years earlier. "I appreciate that you never rush anything," Alina told Daniel one evening as they walked together through a quiet park near her apartment. "After everything I experienced in my previous marriage, I needed someone who understood the importance of building trust gradually, through consistent honesty rather than grand gestures." "I understand why patience matters to you," Daniel replied, his expression thoughtful and genuine. "I have no interest in rushing something that has the potential to become truly meaningful. We have time to build this properly, with honesty as our foundation from the very beginning." Their relationship continued developing over subsequent months, characterized by exactly the kind of transparent communication and mutual respect that had been so painfully absent during Alina's marriage to Alastair. Daniel never made promises he couldn't keep, never disappeared for unexplained absences, and consistently demonstrated through his actions, rather than simply his words, that he valued Alina as an equal partner rather than someone whose primary purpose was maintaining appearances or fulfilling social obligations. Occasionally, news of Alastair reached Alina through mutual acquaintances or shared social circles that occasionally overlapped despite their divorce. She learned that he had eventually entered another relationship, though it apparently ended after only a few months, the details remaining unclear through the second-hand information that reached her. She felt no particular emotional reaction to these updates, genuine indifference having replaced whatever lingering hurt or anger had once colored her feelings toward her former husband. Camille, she learned through similar channels, had eventually left the country entirely, pursuing opportunities abroad that removed her completely from the social circles Alina still occasionally encountered through her continued friendship with Margaret and other former acquaintances from her marriage. Alina felt genuine relief at this development, though not from any lingering resentment, simply appreciation that this particular chapter of her past felt increasingly distant and disconnected from her current life. Margaret remained a consistent presence throughout Alina's transformation, the elderly cousin who had first offered comfort during that devastating dinner party, continuing to provide wisdom and genuine support throughout the following years. Their relationship deepened into genuine friendship, transcending the formal family connection that had originally brought them together. "I've watched you become someone truly remarkable," Margaret told Alina during one of their regular visits, nearly 2 years after the dinner party that had irrevocably altered the trajectory of Alina's life. "Not that you weren't remarkable before, but there's a confidence and authenticity to you now that simply wasn't present during your marriage." "I think I was always capable of becoming this person," Alina reflected. "I just needed the right circumstances, however painful, to finally discover that strength within myself." "Sometimes the most difficult experiences ultimately provide the greatest opportunities for genuine growth," Margaret observed. "Though I certainly wouldn't wish that particular evening upon anyone, watching what emerged from it has been genuinely inspiring." As Alina reflected on her journey during quiet moments of contemplation, she recognized that her transformation extended far beyond simply rebuilding her life following a devastating betrayal. She had fundamentally reconstructed her relationship with herself, learning to trust her own instincts and judgment rather than constantly deferring to external expectations and social obligations that had defined so much of her earlier existence. She had learned that genuine strength sometimes manifested not through dramatic confrontation or public displays of emotion, but through quiet, deliberate choices made with clarity and self-respect, exactly as she had demonstrated that evening when she calmly removed her wedding ring and walked away from a marriage that no longer served her genuine well-being and happiness. That single moment, setting her ring down beside Alistair's plate and choosing to leave rather than continue tolerating public humiliation and private betrayal, had ultimately become the catalyst for an entire transformation of her identity and life circumstances. What began as devastating heartbreak had gradually evolved into genuine opportunity, allowing Alina to rediscover passions and interests that had been buried beneath years of dutiful compliance, with expectations that never truly reflected her authentic self. On the second anniversary of that fateful dinner party, Alina found herself once again standing on her apartment balcony, though the apartment itself had changed. A larger and more comfortable space she had purchased outright using funds from her divorce settlement combined with her growing museum salary. Daniel joined her that evening, having gradually become a consistent and cherished presence in her daily life over recent months. "Do you ever think about that night?" Daniel asked gently, understanding the significance of the date without needing extensive explanation, since Alina had shared the full story with him early in their relationship, believing genuine honesty essential to building lasting trust between them. "Occasionally," Alina admitted, leaning against the balcony railing as she considered his question thoughtfully. "Though the memory feels increasingly distant now, more like something that happened to a different version of myself rather than a defining trauma I continue carrying forward." "How do you feel about it now, looking back with some distance and perspective?" Alina considered the question carefully before responding, genuinely reflecting on the complicated emotions that particular evening still evoked, even years later. "I feel grateful, honestly, despite how strange that might sound given the pain and humiliation I experienced that night. That evening forced me to confront truths about my marriage and my own identity that I had been avoiding for years. Without that painful catalyst, I'm not certain I would have found the courage to pursue the life I've built since then." "You transformed something devastating into genuine opportunity," Daniel observed. "That takes remarkable strength and resilience." "I think it also required good people surrounding me throughout the process," Alina added, thinking of Charlotte's unwavering support, Margaret's wisdom and genuine care, Priya's authentic friendship, and now Daniel's patient, honest presence in her life. "I couldn't have managed this transformation entirely alone." They stood together in comfortable silence for several moments, watching the city lights spread beneath them, before Daniel spoke again, his tone shifting slightly, carrying a note of genuine seriousness beneath his usual warmth. "Alina, I've been thinking carefully about our relationship, about everything we've built together over these past months," he began, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I know your previous experience with marriage was devastating, and I would never want to rush you towards something you're not genuinely ready for. But I want you to know that whenever you feel prepared, whenever the timing feels right for you, I would be honored to build a future together, one built entirely on the honesty and mutual respect you deserve." Alina felt tears gathering in her eyes, moved by the genuine sincerity in Daniel's words, so different from the grand romantic gestures Alistair had once offered, gestures that ultimately proved hollow and meaningless given his subsequent betrayal. Daniel's words carried no urgency, no pressure, simply genuine commitment offered with patience and understanding. "I appreciate you saying that," Alina said softly, reaching for his hand. "I think, for the first time since everything happened, I can genuinely imagine building that kind of future again, though I appreciate you understanding that timing needs to feel right for both of us." "There's no rush," Daniel reassured her. "We have time to build this properly, exactly as we've been doing since the beginning." Standing together on that balcony, 2 years removed from the devastating public humiliation that had once threatened to define her entire identity, Alina felt genuine peace settling over her, a recognition that she had successfully transformed profound pain into authentic growth and lasting happiness. She thought again about that pivotal moment at the dinner table, removing her wedding ring and setting it down with quiet dignity rather than dramatic confrontation, choosing her own self-respect over the appearance of a perfect marriage that had never truly existed beyond careful pretense and public performance. That single act of quiet courage had ultimately opened the door to everything that followed: her career achievements, her authentic friendships, her rediscovered passions, and now, potentially, a genuine partnership built on the honesty and mutual respect that had been so completely absent from her first marriage. Alina understood, standing there beside Daniel with the city lights spreading beneath them, that sometimes the most devastating moments in life ultimately become the foundation for genuine transformation, provided one possesses the courage to walk away from what no longer serves authentic happiness, and the resilience to build something entirely new from the wreckage left behind. She had walked away from that dinner table 2 years earlier carrying nothing but a small bag of belongings and a broken heart. She stood now, on this balcony, having built an entirely new life defined by genuine achievement, authentic connection, and hard-won self-respect, proof that even the most public and painful humiliation could ultimately become the catalyst for a genuinely remarkable transformation. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a wedding, small and intimate, held in the very garden where Alina had once sat alone in devastation, questioning everything she believed about her life and her marriage. This time, the garden belonged to a rented countryside venue, chosen deliberately by Alina and Daniel for its quiet beauty rather than any connection to grandeur or family legacy. Charlotte stood beside her sister as maid of honor, tears streaming freely down her face as she watched Alina exchange vows with a man who had earned her trust through years of consistent honesty rather than empty promises. Priya sat among the small gathering of guests, along with Margaret, who had insisted on attending despite her advancing age, determined to witness this next chapter in Alina's remarkable journey. "I never imagined I would feel this genuinely happy again," Alina whispered to Charlotte as they prepared for the ceremony. "Not after everything that happened." "You built this happiness yourself," Charlotte reminded her, squeezing her sister's hand. "Nobody handed this to you. You earned every bit of it through your own courage and determination." The ceremony itself felt entirely different from Alina's first wedding, intimate rather than grand, filled with genuine emotion rather than careful performance for social approval. Daniel's vows carried no elaborate promises about duty or legacy, focusing instead on simple commitments to honesty, partnership, and mutual respect throughout, whatever challenges their future together might bring. Alina's own vows reflected the wisdom she had gained through her difficult journey, acknowledging openly that trust required consistent effort rather than assumption, that genuine love manifested through daily choices rather than grand romantic gestures alone. "I promise to communicate honestly, even when honesty feels difficult," she said, meeting Daniel's eyes with genuine sincerity. "I promise to value our partnership as equals, never allowing duty or appearance to overshadow authentic connection between us." After the ceremony concluded, guests gathered for a simple reception, nothing like the elaborate formal dinners that had characterized Alina's previous social obligations. Instead, everyone sat together at long wooden tables, sharing genuine conversation and laughter, the atmosphere warm and unpretentious in ways that felt deeply meaningful to Alina after years of navigating rigid social expectations. Margaret approached her during a quiet moment, embracing Alina warmly before stepping back to study her with obvious affection. "You know, dear, I've attended many weddings throughout my long life, but few have felt as genuinely joyful as this one. There's something remarkable about watching someone build happiness on their own terms, rather than simply fulfilling expectations placed upon them by others. I couldn't have reached this moment without the support of people like you," Alina said sincerely. "You reminded me, during the darkest period of my life, that I possessed value beyond my role as Duchess, that I deserved genuine happiness rather than simply enduring circumstances that had stopped serving my well-being years earlier." "You always possessed that value," Margaret corrected gently. "You simply needed reminding of it, given how thoroughly your marriage had convinced you otherwise." As the reception continued into the evening, Alina found herself reflecting on the remarkable distance she had traveled since that devastating dinner party years earlier. The pain of that evening remained part of her history, an experience that had genuinely shaped who she became, but it no longer defined her identity or limited her sense of possibility regarding her own future happiness. She thought about the countless women who likely faced similar circumstances, trapped within relationships that demanded constant compromise and quiet endurance of disrespect, convinced that maintaining appearances mattered more than genuine well-being and authentic happiness. She hoped, in whatever small way possible, that her own story might offer encouragement to others facing similar difficult decisions about whether to stay within circumstances that no longer served their genuine happiness. Several months after her wedding, Alina received an unexpected invitation to speak at a conference focused on women's empowerment and personal transformation following significant life challenges. Initially hesitant about sharing such personal details publicly, she eventually accepted after careful consideration, recognizing that her story might genuinely help others navigating similar circumstances. Standing before an audience of several hundred attendees, Alina spoke honestly about her journey, from the devastating public humiliation at that dinner party through the difficult process of rebuilding her identity and life circumstances entirely separate from her previous marriage. "I spent years convincing myself that maintaining appearances mattered more than my own genuine happiness," she told the audience, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of sharing such personal experiences publicly. "I ignored countless warning signs, excused disrespectful behavior, and gradually lost touch with my own authentic identity and passions, all in service of preserving an image of perfect marriage that ultimately proved entirely hollow." She continued, describing the moment she finally recognized that she deserved better treatment, the quiet courage required to remove her wedding ring and walk away from everything familiar, despite the uncertainty and fear that decision initially provoked. "That moment of walking away didn't feel triumphant or empowering in the immediate aftermath," she admitted honestly. "It felt terrifying, uncertain, and profoundly painful. But it also represented the first genuine act of self-respect I had demonstrated in years, choosing my own dignity over the comfort of familiar circumstances that had stopped serving my authentic well-being." The audience listened intently, many nodding with obvious recognition, suggesting that Alina's experience resonated deeply with others who had faced similar difficult choices within their own relationships and circumstances. After her presentation concluded, several audience members approached her privately, sharing their own experiences and expressing gratitude for her willingness to speak so openly about such personal and painful circumstances. One woman, perhaps in her 40s, embraced Alina tearfully. I've been trying to find the courage to leave a relationship that stopped serving my happiness years ago, she confided quietly. Hearing your story, understanding that genuine transformation and happiness remain possible even after such devastating circumstances, gives me hope that I might find similar courage within myself. Alina squeezed the woman's hand warmly, understanding intimately the fear and uncertainty that accompanied such difficult decisions. You already possess that courage within yourself, she reassured her. Sometimes it simply requires the right circumstances or support to fully access that strength. This experience of sharing her story publicly, combined with the genuine gratitude expressed by audience members, encouraged Alina to continue speaking occasionally at similar events over subsequent years, always emphasizing the importance of authentic self-respect and the courage required to prioritize genuine happiness over simply maintaining comfortable but ultimately unfulfilling circumstances. Her career at the museum continued flourishing alongside these speaking engagements, Alina eventually earning promotion to senior curator, overseeing significant exhibitions that drew international attention and critical acclaim. Her expertise in European decorative arts became widely recognized throughout the academic and museum community, colleagues frequently seeking her guidance and collaboration on significant projects. 3 years after her wedding to Daniel, Alina gave birth to their daughter, a moment of profound joy that further solidified her sense of building a genuinely fulfilling life, defined entirely by authentic choices rather than external expectations or obligations. She approached motherhood with the same thoughtful intentionality that had characterized her broader life transformation, determined to raise her daughter with genuine confidence and self-respect, rather than the constrained sense of duty and performance that had once defined her own younger years. I want her to understand from the very beginning that her own happiness and well-being matter genuinely, Alina told Daniel one evening as they watched their daughter sleeping peacefully. I want her to grow up understanding that she deserves honesty and respect within any relationship she eventually chooses to pursue, and that she should never feel obligated to sacrifice her authentic identity simply to maintain appearances or fulfill others' expectations. She's fortunate to have you as her mother, Daniel replied softly, wrapping his arm around Alina's shoulders. You'll teach her these lessons not just through words, but through the example of the remarkable life you've built for yourself. Looking back across the years since that devastating dinner party, Alina recognized how thoroughly that single evening had reshaped the entire trajectory of her existence, transforming what initially felt like the most painful and humiliating experience of her life into the catalyst for genuine, lasting transformation and authentic happiness. She had learned, through this remarkable journey, that sometimes the most devastating moments ultimately provide unexpected opportunities for growth, provided one possesses sufficient courage to walk away from circumstances that no longer serve genuine well-being, and sufficient resilience to gradually build something entirely new and authentic from the wreckage left behind. The quiet dignity she had demonstrated that evening, removing her wedding ring and walking away without dramatic confrontation or public outburst, had ultimately proven far more powerful than any angry scene could have achieved. That simple, deliberate gesture had communicated everything necessary: her own self-respect and refusal to continue tolerating disrespect, without requiring additional words or explanation. Years later, when people occasionally asked about that pivotal moment, curious about the strength required to walk away so calmly despite such devastating public humiliation, Alina always offered the same honest reflection. I didn't feel particularly strong in that moment, she would explain. I felt broken, humiliated, and profoundly uncertain about what my future might hold. But somewhere beneath that pain, I recognized that continuing to tolerate such treatment would only cause deeper, more lasting damage to my own sense of self-worth. Walking away wasn't about demonstrating strength to others. It was about finally choosing myself, prioritizing my own genuine happiness and dignity over the comfortable familiarity of circumstances that had stopped serving my authentic well-being years earlier. That simple, profound choice, made in a single devastating moment at a dinner table years earlier, had ultimately opened the door to an entirely new life, defined by authentic achievement, genuine connection, and the kind of lasting happiness that could only emerge from choosing self-respect over the comfortable illusion of maintaining appearances at any cost. Alina's story, ultimately, became not simply a narrative about betrayal and humiliation, but rather a testament to resilience, authentic self-discovery, and the profound transformation possible when someone finally finds the courage to prioritize their own genuine happiness and dignity above all else.